What if the wars we call modern are not modern at all, but echoes of something ancient, something written long before gunpowder, satellites, and nuclear codes ever existed? Something described in symbols and visions thousands of years ago that still seem to whisper beneath the noise of headlines and breaking news alerts. What if the signal behind today's conflicts was transmitted centuries ago, encoded in prophecy, preserved in scripture, and now unfolding in ways that feel both shocking and strangely familiar? We live in an age of constant alerts where images of cities under fire and leaders exchanging threats travel across the planet in seconds, yet beneath the speed of information there's a slower pattern, a deeper rhythm, one that has surfaced again and again. Throughout history, rising with empires, collapsing with nations, and resurfacing in new forms, as if history itself were following a script written long before the modern world was born. Ancient texts, like the Book of Daniel, describe visions of great beasts rising from the sea, each representing powerful kingdoms that would dominate the earth in succession, empires that would expand with force, consolidate power, and eventually fall, replaced by new powers. Equally ambitious and equally temporary, a cycle not described as random chaos but as a sequence, a pattern, a progression that suggests history is not merely a collection of accidents, but a structured unfolding. In the Book of Revelation, written in a time of intense political oppression under the Roman Empire, the imagery becomes even more dramatic, describing wars, rumors of wars, global systems of control, economic restrictions, and a world increasingly unified under centralized authority. And while the language is symbolic, the themes are unmistakable. Concentrated power, conflict between nations, moral decline, and a final convergence of political and spiritual forces on a global scale. Even earlier in the Book of Ezekiel, there is a vision of a coalition of nations rising from the north against a vulnerable people, a multi-nation alignment driven by strategic interests and ambition, a scenario that has sparked debate for centuries because it describes not just a single war but a coordinated movement of powers, an alignment that feels strikingly similar to the alliances and geopolitical blocs forming in our own time. When we examine the last 100 years, from 2 world wars to the Cold War standoff between nuclear superpowers, from regional proxy conflicts to the emergence of cyber warfare and space militarization, we see not isolated incidents, but escalating complexity, as if each generation inherits a more interconnected and more volatile version of the same underlying tension. The struggle for dominance, security, and control in a shrinking world. Technology has amplified this pattern in ways ancient writers could only describe in symbols, because today's surveillance can span continents. Financial systems can be centralized and monitored in real time, and weapons can be deployed across oceans in minutes, creating a global battlefield that is no longer defined by borders alone, but by networks, data, and invisible lines of influence. And when prophecy speaks of the whole world being affected for the first time in history, that possibility feels technologically plausible. Consider the language of wars and rumors of wars, spoken by Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, a phrase that captures not only physical conflict but the atmosphere of constant expectation, the psychological tension that keeps societies on edge. Because modern warfare is not only fought with missiles, but with information, fear, and narrative, shaping public perception long before the first shot is fired. Throughout history, empires have promised peace through strength, stability through dominance, unity through control. Yet each attempt to secure lasting order through concentrated power has eventually produced resistance, fragmentation, and conflict, reinforcing the ancient warning that human systems, no matter how advanced, remain vulnerable to the same flaws of pride, ambition, and moral compromise that brought down civilizations long before our own. The pattern becomes clearer when we step back and look at the rise of global institutions, multinational alliances, economic unions, and technological platforms that bind nations together more tightly than ever before, creating unprecedented interdependence, while also increasing the stakes of every disagreement. Because when supply chains, energy grids, and communication networks are interconnected, a single regional conflict can ripple across the entire planet. Is it possible that the signal behind modern wars is not merely political rivalry, but the acceleration of a long-foretold convergence? A moment when humanity's drive toward unity and control reaches a tipping point. when the systems designed to prevent chaos begin to resemble the very structures described in ancient warnings about centralized authority and global allegiance. In prophecy, the imagery of beasts and horns and crowns represents power structures, coalitions, and leaders who rise quickly and fall dramatically. And when we observe how rapidly governments can change, how swiftly alliances can shift, and how fragile even the most stable nations can become under economic or military pressure, the symbolism feels less like myth and more like metaphor, a coded description of recurring political reality. The revelation hidden in plain sight is not a date or a specific headline, but a pattern. Concentration of power, followed by conflict. Promises of security, followed by greater instability. Technological advancement accompanied by moral and social strain, and a growing sense that the world is moving towards something climactic, something irreversible, something that feels less like random history and more like an unfolding sequence. This does not mean every conflict is the final chapter, nor that every leader is a figure from prophecy. But it does mean the ancient warnings about pride, oppression, deception, and global turmoil remain relevant because they describe enduring human tendencies amplified by modern capability. And when capability expands faster than wisdom, the risk of catastrophic conflict increases. So the question is not whether wars will continue, because history suggests they will, but whether we recognize the deeper signal beneath them, the warning that power without restraint eventually destabilizes itself, that alliances built solely on fear eventually fracture, and that ignoring moral foundations while pursuing dominance may accelerate. The very collapse leaders claim to prevent as global tensions rise, as nations test boundaries and redraw lines of influence, as economic systems strain under pressure and new technologies blur the line between civilian and military power. We stand in a moment that feels familiar to the pages of ancient texts, a moment of anticipation, of uncertainty, of escalating complexity, where the past seems to echo through the present with unsettling clarity. The ancient writers did not describe fighter jets or digital currencies, but they described human ambition, centralized authority, widespread conflict, and a world watching events unfold on a scale larger than any previous generation could imagine. And in that sense, the signal behind modern wars may not be about specific weapons or specific nations, but about the culmination of patterns that have been building for centuries. If history truly moves in cycles shaped by recurring human behavior, and if prophecy captured those behaviors in symbolic form, then our task is not to speculate wildly, but to observe carefully, to compare patterns, to recognize signals, and to ask whether we are repeating the same trajectory that has led empires from confidence to collapse again and again. The final warning is not shouted but whispered through centuries of recorded conflict. Unchecked power invites resistance, fear breeds aggression, and unity enforced through control eventually cracks under its own weight. And when these forces converge on a global scale, the consequences are no longer regional but planetary. This is not a call to panic, nor a declaration of imminent catastrophe, but an invitation to awareness, because understanding patterns changes how we interpret events, how we evaluate leadership, and how we prepare for the future. And ignoring the signal does not silence it. It only ensures we are surprised when it grows louder. The transmission from the past is still active, carried through scripture, history, and the recurring rise and fall of nations. And whether one views it as prophecy, pattern recognition, or both, the message is consistent. Power shifts, empires tremble, wars ignite, and humanity stands at crossroads shaped by choices made long before the first headline appears. The question is no longer whether ancient warnings speak to modern wars, but whether we are willing to see the connection, to trace the pattern, and to recognize that the signal has been broadcasting for millennia, waiting for a generation capable of hearing it clearly. This has been the signal behind modern wars and ancient warnings. And the transmission is not ending. It is intensifying. And the next chapter is not being written in secret. It is unfolding in real time before our eyes. For those who are watching, for those who are listening, for those who understand that history does not whisper without reason.